I'm going to make the case for why and when you can use discrimination and racism and why this is justified. First of all, what is racism and discrimination? Racism is prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism against a person or people on the basis of their membership to a particular racial or ethnic group. Prejudice means a preconceived opinion that is not based on reason or actual experience. Discrimination means the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people, such as on the grounds of ethnicity, age, sex, or disability. Antagonism means active hostility or opposition towards a particular individual or group. Antagonism is obviously never desirable. For prejudice, there can be some very context-specific situations where it can make sense. For discrimination, this is where it is more commonly justifiable in a number of contexts. Are there justified reasons to treat people differently based not just on their ethnicity or race, but also their religion, age, sex, or many other things? Yes, absolutely, there can be differences between different groups of people, and in some situations, people should be able to treat other people differently. One obvious example for this is how individuals should have the freedom of choice to date, marry, and reproduce with whomever they like. If they have the preference that they want to partner with someone that looks like them, they are entitled to do so. They also might prefer that their partner looks differently than themselves, or for them to be between a certain age range, or that they have certain physical traits. All of these preferences are valid, and they have the right and freedom to pursue their own preferences. Another example could be when someone is walking along a street and the person walking towards them is part of a group that is statistically more likely to steal from them or harm them. Everyone has freedom of choice. They can decide themselves whether they want to cross the road to avoid situations that they believe will put them at risk. Prioritizing their safety is a valid reason to cross the road. They aren't harming the other person by doing so. Let's think about 3 different reasons why you might choose to discriminate against someone when you are deciding whether or not to cross the road. One is you have numerous lived experiences with this group of people, and these experiences were predominantly negative. Another is you have heard of these negative experiences from other people whom you trust. And the third is you've seen reliable sources of data that track crimes based on age, ethnicity, religion, or some other factors. If any of these experiences or pieces of information lead to the conclusion that it is in your interest to cross the road to increase your safety, then you of course have the right to do so. Arguably, in these situations, you can also justifiably apply prejudice as well. If someone doesn't know the other person's background and all they know is that they are from a different group, they are completely entitled to act in a way that guarantees their safety in the situation where someone is unknown. It's not fair on any individual to expect them to not prioritize their own safety in the face of a potential threat. They aren't required to prove that another person isn't a threat to make a decision that is in their self-interest of prioritizing safety. You cannot force someone to put themselves into a position where they potentially become less safe and uncomfortable. If safety is their highest priority, which is a perfectly reasonable preference, they are entitled to cross the road without needing to make any justification whatsoever. So this is an example on an individual level why you might apply discrimination or even prejudice to make a decision where you treat people differently. Now, you could argue in both these cases it is unfair on the other racial, ethnic, religious, or any other particular grouping of people. They won't get to date certain people who have those preferences, and they might notice that people are crossing the road when they walk towards them. These individuals might notice that they are being treated differently. But is that unfair and unjust? No, it is not. You can't force people to partner with people they don't want to be with. You also can't force someone to not act in their self-interest, which could be to prioritize their own safety, especially when their actions are not harming anyone else. These are both examples of where discrimination is justifiable. I currently like to call this preference discrimination. You have certain preferences in how you want to live your private life, such as how you interact with others, who you date, and who you spend time with. You may decide to apply your preferences and discriminate against others to live your life in a way that matches your preferences. Let's now think about freedom of association. Freedom of association is the individual right to form, join, and participate in groups. This freedom also means you should not be compelled to join any particular group. Let's say you make a public community group for mountain biking. The people that set up this group want to apply their preference discrimination against ethnicity and religion. In their private lives, they don't have to spend time and associate with any particular group. They have the freedom of choice to spend time with and associate with whomever they like. But if it's a public group that others are able to join, this is where that same preference discrimination becomes problematic. You might have the personal experiences or data that supports a reason why a certain group is more problematic or less cohesive in this group than others. But when the group is public, this can result in a far more direct way to segregate different communities. If there aren't any other people around to form another mountain biking group, then certain people could feel very excluded from the community. The discrimination could naturally lead to more disputes and hostility. So this is where anti-discrimination laws make sense. You don't want someone creating a public group and not allowing others to participate based on ethnicity, religion, or other forms of discrimination. Let's consider a business-related scenario. What if one ethnic group or religious group was more problematic than others in relation to theft from a local shop? The business owner is currently losing money due to the actions from this group. Applying their own preference discrimination could mean that they don't want to offer their goods or services to this group due to the negative experiences they are having. Anti-discrimination laws prevent them from doing this, and this is good as not all individuals from that group are necessarily problematic. The individuals from this group of people who commit crimes should be the ones who are punished and potentially put in jail. The problem with this approach is the justice process, and jail services are not free. Society is paying for this through taxation. So if a large number of people from certain groups are committing these crimes, this can be a large burden on society. Criminal activity makes society worse for everyone. So if a certain group is committing proportionally the most crime across society, it will be important to factor this in when thinking about how to solve this problem. This now brings us to the topic of migration, self-determination, and the collective decision-making of the population at the national level. Self-determination is the collective right of a group of people to determine their political status and to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The ancestral population of any given country has the right to self-determination to govern themselves based on their own preferences and interests. This is where we can consider the application of collective preference discrimination. If another group, whether ethnic, religious, or anything else, is being problematic, the ancestral population could have the preference to not live with certain groups due to these problems. An existing population should have self-determination and freedom of choice to decide who is allowed into their country and who should leave. If they can't make these decisions, they don't really have self-determination as a distinct group. It is not fair to impose other groups of people onto the ancestral population. The ancestral population having self-determination means they could reject certain groups of people from joining their society. It also means they could ask groups that have entered to leave after they had the experience of living with that group. You could argue this is unfair on the group of people who aren't allowed into the country or that are being removed. But this decision from the ancestral population doesn't harm them directly. They might have less choices on where they can live, but they can always live in their own ancestral homeland. The ancestral population does not have this backup option. This could be their only homeland. So self-determination means they have the right to decide how they want to live in that country. If the ancestral population was not allowed to decide who is allowed into their country, this would be unfair on them. It would remove their own right as a collective group for self-determination. The ancestral population would now need to live in a state that doesn't match their preferences. They would be forced to live with anyone that comes into the country. This degrades their freedom of choice and their freedom of association within the country, as now they are forced to live amongst people that they would prefer not to. Now the ancestral population would have to face all the problems that these other groups might cause and pay for the burden of those costs. Self-determination helps with preventing this problem from happening, as if certain non-ancestral groups are problematic, they can be asked to leave. So you can make the argument that it's unfair on either side, but the more obvious side that is correct is protecting a distinct group's own freedoms and self-determination in their own country. Ancestral populations that have self-determination can decide themselves how to handle migration and citizenship. This means they are entitled to invite people in, and also it means they can ask them to leave. Anti-discrimination laws still make sense for those that reside within the country. If the ancestral population has invited migrants into their society, it makes sense that these people are treated equally whilst they are there. This helps to protect everyone who lives in a society. A majority might approve migration of certain groups, so anti-discrimination laws protect those groups against the minority that rejects those groups. However, if the majority of the ancestral population change their mind, they have the right to ask certain groups to leave. Protect the rights of migrant groups that are accepted into the society, but also protect the rights of the ancestral population to decide who is allowed in their country or not. Ancestral populations having self-determination means they will make migration decisions based on who they want to live with, which in some cases might just be amongst themselves. They are entitled to identify issues and resolve them by changing migration policy and deporting individuals or groups that they no longer want to live with. Preference discrimination is a justified form of discrimination to ensure that self-sovereign nations and their population can live in a way that they prefer. No population should be forced to be burdened with accepting migration from other countries from across the world. Discrimination does not mean someone is harming anyone else. All individuals can live their life as they like in their private life. Discrimination is not fine in a professional setting or within public groups. These are situations where people are already living in that society and you want a more harmonious coexistence. But accepting the fact that discrimination is undesirable and unfair in these contexts does emphasize the need for self-determination at the national level for the ancestral population. Collectively, a society can apply preference-based discrimination to achieve the most desirable outcomes for their own society. That could mean creating a high-trust society, increasing safety, reducing the risks of cultural changes, or just because a population prefers that their society remains very similar to the way it is in relation to demographics. The ancestral populations have the right to self-determine their own migration policy so that they are aligned with their preferences. So, this is why discrimination and racism can be justified at both the personal level and the collective level for nation states. No nation should be forced to live with groups they don't want to live with, just like no individual can be forced into situations in their private life that they do not consent to. Freedom of choice, freedom of association, and self-determination. You are allowed to have preferences for how you want to live your private life. You are allowed to have preferences as a collective group in a nation state about who you want to live with in your society. These are viable reasons to use preference discrimination. And as discrimination is part of racism, it is also therefore viable to use racism in these contexts. A population can exercise their right to self-determination by applying preference discrimination. This means they are entitled to deny the entry of any ethnic or racial group into their country, and that could be due to their own preferences to not live with certain groups. Although we may agree that discrimination and racism is not desirable, that preference doesn't lead to the conclusion that individuals and distinct groups cannot exercise their own rights and freedoms. Now, you might define racism and discrimination differently than the definitions I've used. If you think my definitions or interpretations are wrong, I'm eager to hear your thoughts and disagreements in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you all in the next one.